Blanket weed, the bane of all ponds. I think over the years, of all the issues that customers ask me for advice on, blanket weed is up there as probably the most talked about problem. But what is blanket weed? Is it a problem? And how can you prevent it in your pond? Well, I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics, and today I'm in this pond that I regularly visit and service, and it's an ideal opportunity for me to talk about how to control this horrendous hair algae. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy any pond related topics, please hit the like and the subscribe button and the bell icon at the bottom of this page, and you'll be updated then with any new videos that I post. Now, blanket weed. Look at this stuff, horrendous. And it grows so rapidly. 2 or 3 weeks ago, this pond was beautifully clear, hardly any blanket weed at all, and suddenly this warm weather and sunlight, we've had an algae explosion, and it's completely covered the entire surface of this pond. And as you can see, it grows really, really thick, like hair or candy floss. And in fact, some of its common names are hair algae or candy floss algae. And what is blanket weed? Well, blanket weed is a type of algae. All algae, obviously, very primitive and early life forms on our planet Earth. They've been around for many millions of years and they're here to stay. And in ponds, there's 2 main groups of algae that we talk about, and they tend to be single cellular algae, stuff that we call planktonic algae that causes green water, and multicellular algae, which is the physical stuff that you can physically touch. Slime algae and blanket weeds are all grouped into multicellular algae. Blanket weed itself isn't necessarily a problem in a pond, and that could be a little bit controversial, I know. But from a wildlife point of view, there's a huge amount of benefit that this blanket weed, this algae, will bring to a pond. It's right down at the bottom of the food chain, and it can sustain the huge pyramid of life right up to some of the higher, bigger predators in the pond. So a certain amount of blanket weed can actually be beneficial. But of course, it's highly unsightly. It can choke and clog up all of your plants, and if you're running filtration, it can block up your pumps and equipment. And so it really is something that we want to try and deter in a pond. And thankfully, generally, it's quite easy to control. Now, what causes blanket weed in ponds? Well, the 2 most important factors are nutrients and sunlight, and both of which this pond gets in abundance. If you've got a pond in a sunny position, and ideally, and perhaps it sounds a bit contradictory, but you should have a pond in a sunny position, algae of all types at some stage will become a problem. Now, there are natural methods of helping to prevent some forms of algae, and as long as you've got a healthy population of pond plants, an abundance of marginal plants, water lilies and plants with floating leaves like water hawthorns to shade the surface, and an abundance of aerating or oxygenating plants, these plants are going to help to compete with algae for nutrients, stripping the water of this important nutrient that would feed algae. And that can help naturally to prevent algae. But in most domestic small ponds, you know, smaller than a volume of a couple of thousand gallons or so, small volumes of water tend to be a lot less stable, and so it's much harder to try to naturally control these levels of nutrients in a pond. In a big lake, once you've got a healthy balance, ponds then tend to remain a lot more stable. But in smaller garden ponds like this, we tend to rely on mechanical means, filtration and chemical control or treatment control to prevent algae from forming. Now, filtration, a pump, a mechanical filter and an ultraviolet sterilizer, that's designed to control green water, the single cellular algae. Planktonic or single cellular algae is far, far too small to get taken out by most filtration systems. These tiny single cellular microscopic particles just get washed straight through the filter and will continue in suspension. So what a UV does is that UV radiation will destroy the single cells of algae, causing them to clump together into bigger pieces that the filtration system can then manage. But once you've got a clear pond, blanket weed could actually become more of a problem. And blanket weed isn't something that's controlled by filtration, because physically it's not coming into contact with that UV light because it's growing in the pond. Now, filtration will help to a certain degree because filtration is going to help to reduce excessive nutrients in the pond. But by far, the most common nutrient which is going to encourage algae to grow is phosphates and nitrates, both of which are not really going to be controlled by filtration. And these are things that need to be then controlled with plants, both of which are going to use phosphates and nitrates as a natural food source, and by treatments and controls. Now, trying to minimise and prevent nutrient content in the water is a really important factor in the control of green water and blanket weed. If you've got fish in the pond, making sure that it's not overstocked, that there's a minimal amount of fish waste that's present in the pond, that you keep your filtration system looked after, operating efficiently, making sure you're not overfeeding the fish and that any uneaten food in the pond is removed after a few minutes. That's a really big one actually. Floating food left in the pond, pellets and sticks, and particularly pond flakes, will very quickly start to break down and release a lot of their proteins in the water, and this is a huge contributing factor to green water and blanket weed. But another perhaps less known source of nutrients is wash off from the surrounding area going into a pond. Now this particular pond has got a very long stream that runs down the garden into the pond, and this stream provides unfortunately a perfect catchment for a huge amount of nutrients from a large area to get washed off into this pond. Some of the stream is bordered onto grass. Well, that's not quite so bad, although if you use fertilisers on the lawn you need to be careful. But there's a lot of borders and planting areas that are also adjacent to the stream, and this, when it rains, a certain amount of nutrients get washed off from the freshly turned soil, and if there's any compost or mulch, manure, etc., this can be an excessive amount of nutrients that can then get washed off into a pond. It's always really good practice if you've got flower beds and borders beside a pond to try to operate with a no-dig policy. Try not to turn over the soil too much if you can help it, making sure that the soil structure and strata remains firm, and that you've got lots of plants that are growing in the soil to help bind it all together, and that's going to minimise wash off into the pond. Now, if you can control exactly the levels of nutrients in a pond, so for example, if you've got a raised formal pond bordered by stonework and brickwork, and there's no runoff at all from the surrounding garden, it's actually very easy to control blanket weed in a pond. And 1, 2, 3 doses a year of my particular favourite treatment, which is something called cloverleaf blanket answer, I would guarantee will control blanket weed. But when you've got borders and grass and other areas of catchment that can then potentially draw nutrients into the pond, it can be very difficult to reliably control blanket weed. And with this pond, even with monthly doses of blanket weed treatments, occasionally, as you can see, blanket weed is rife. Now, when you're treating the pond with treatments to control blanket weed, it's really important that you try to manually remove as much of the algae first as you can. A huge dieback of algae like this in a pond actually could potentially pose more of a problem than the blanket weed itself. And this large amount of plant matter growing in a pond, decomposing all at once, is going to strip the pond of oxygen, it's going to have radical effects on the pH in the pond, and can cause major issues, and actually in turn become another life source, nutrient source for other types of algae later on in the future. So it's really important that you go around and you manually remove as much of this first as you can, which is what I'm going to do today. Now, when you're pulling out blanket weed, there's a huge amount of pond life that you're going to find in here. Potentially newts, water beetles, boatmans, baby fish. So if you can, try and lump together all this blanket weed in the shallows or on the edge of the pond and leave it there to dry out for a few days so that much of this wildlife can work its way back down into the pond. So once you've removed as much of the blanket weed as you can, and generally getting in the pond by hand is by far the best method. You can use a net to try and scoop it out. You can use a stick or a brush to wind it all up, and a bit like candy floss, it'll start to draw across the surface of the pond. But once you've removed as much of this physically as you can, then it's time to treat the pond. Right, that's the bulk of the blanket weed removed. Actually, when you see it in a big pile like this, it doesn't perhaps look quite so much as you'd expect, having covered the whole pond. But it's a pretty heavy, thick, dense pile of algae here. Now, in the removal of this, as I've been pulling it out, there's been a huge amount of life. That's not aquatic life, that's a bumblebee. Off you go. But within here, I've had newts caught up, dragonfly larvae, a lovely great diving beetle larvae, which I wish I'd caught on camera, but sadly I didn't. So it's really important to make sure that this is piled up at the pond edge, and I'm going to go and put it in the shade, because on a hot day like this, it's 30 degrees. Nothing out here is going to last very long. So I'll pop that in the shade, give it a few days, let it dry off, as I say, and then it's very easy to move, it's a lot lighter. Mulches down, compost down into nothing, so pop it in your compost heap, mulch it around some plants, or stick it in your green waste bin. So now we're in a position where we can think about treating the pond. Now, my blanket weed treatment of choice is none other than cloverleaf blanket answer. If you're familiar with ponds, at some stage you've probably heard about this stuff. I spent almost 20 years working behind the counter, working at various water gardens, talking to customers, and of all the products and algae treatments and magic potions and things that I'd sold over the years, Blanket Answer was consecutively, again and again, the one product which everybody said worked reliably every time. And of course, as I've now set up my own business and maintain and look after and build ponds myself, it's a product that I use and I can vouch for its reliability. In the instances where it doesn't work, and I have to say that this is one pond where it needs a lot more frequent doses of algae treatments, that's because there's a constant refreshing source of nutrients getting washed into the pond, and so any treatment's going to be very difficult. In fact, prevention there, trying to get on top of the phosphates and the nitrates, sometimes can be a much more important thing to do before then treating for blanket weed. That's something I'll discuss in another video. In fact, Awaza are bringing out, or have released already, a very efficient phosphate remover, which I'd like to discuss on a future video. But Blanket Answer, it's a powder impregnated with enzymes and minerals, and this strips the water of nutrients, starving the algae of food and creating conditions that the algae doesn't like, and so it starts to die back. And it is really, really reliable. But as I say, you do want to make sure you remove as much of the algae physically first before treating with this. Now, my own pond at home had the beginnings of some blanket weed, nothing on this sort of scale, but enough that I could pull it out and it was starting to create a fur around the edge. I removed some of that, although there wasn't a tremendous amount that I needed to worry about. I've given it a dose of blanket weed treatment, Blanket Answer, and within about a fortnight, all of that's gone. And it does very reliably work. It's a powder. You want to, rather than administering it directly into the pond, add it to buckets of pond water, rainwater, tap water, stir it up, let it dissolve until it forms a whitewash solution, and then pour it evenly around the pond. Now, it's a natural product, and it is something that supposedly you can't overdose on, and you can reliably treat 8 to 10 times a year if required. I tend to find 3 good doses a year is all that's required in most ponds. A good spring dose, a good summer dose, and a good kind of autumn winter dose. During the winter months, when the water temperatures are cooler and there's a lot less light, blanket weed and algae tends to be less of a problem, but it does still continue to grow. I think the issue in winter is that there's no real competing plants growing in the pond either. And so blanket weed, if we get a mild winter, can have free reign, continuing to grow, and then that sets you off on a bad foot in the following spring. So make sure you treat it in winter as well. It can be applied monthly. Once you've controlled the blanket weed, if you're concerned about it, you can do much, much smaller maintenance doses. But I just tend to find giving it a big, comprehensive dose 3 times a year, that works for me. Now, dosage on Blanket Answer, they provide you with a little scoop, and that one scoop is supposed to treat 90 gallons. If you were to round it up to approximately 100 gallons, that's quite an easy way of dosing. I do think they tend to scrimp a little bit on this, and I always prefer to overdose slightly. I buy it in large bulk, 10 kilo quantities, making it more cost effective. In a pond of 1,000 gallons, rather than adding sort of 10 to 12 scoops, I'd probably double up and add about 20 scoops. Now, obviously, be careful, and I would never recommend overdosing treatments generally. But with Blanket Answer as a natural product, and having used it time and time and time again, don't be concerned if you put a few extra scoops in the pond. It's going to do more good than harm. Now, before I go adding this to the pond, I've got a few other jobs that I'd like to do, some plants to trim back, a bit of maintenance on the filtration, so I'll get that done first. I'll get the pond topped up before adding the treatments. Now, one other important thing to note is that topping up ponds, obviously at this time of year, with the hot temperatures that we're getting and minimal rain, in fact we've had a very, very dry season for the last few months, topping up the pond with tap water, although frequently necessary, can be another source of nutrients to a pond. And depending on where you live, if you test your local tap water, mains water, you might find that nitrates and phosphates themselves are actually already very high. And so by topping a pond up, you're constantly putting another food source back into the pond. Obviously, where possible, topping up with rainwater would be desirable. Realistically, most people would top up with tap water, and it's something that I do myself. I'm running the hose into the pond now, and as long as it's small, frequent top-ups, weekly, a few inches here and there, that's not a problem. Time to add the blanket weed treatment. Now, if the pond was crystal clear, which it normally is, when I apply this treatment, the pond becomes very, very milky, very cloudy. That's normal, it's harmless, if a little unsightly, but don't worry, it will settle in clear over a few days. You may find after that there's a slight sort of chalky residue or a few patches of undissolved Blanket Answer powder, and if you see that, use your net or a long-handled brush, just kind of sweep it up into suspension, get it back into the water column, and it will slowly dissolve that way. But it is really important that you make sure you try to dissolve as much of this first in water rather than just applying it in its dry form as a powder directly to the pond. Otherwise you will find you'll have clumps of it in the pond for weeks and weeks and weeks. I like to dose this up in doses of kind of 5 scoops. 2, 3, 4, 5. Mixed up with some pond water. Evenly trying to administer this around the pond, making sure that as much of it as possible is fully dissolved into the water. And I'll apply doses of 5 scoops, each 5 scoops being approximately 500 gallons. And just making sure that all the pond looks cloudy. Now if you're entertaining, you've got guests around, and you want your pond to be a feature and a focal point, it's probably best not to add this, because your pond isn't going to look its best for a few days. Now once you've added this to the pond, it's really important that you make sure you keep aeration and circulation to a maximum. And that's for 2 reasons. One, to make sure that the treatment is circulated around the pond, which is going to make it more effective. But 2, and perhaps more importantly, it's to make sure that your pond is as aerated and oxygenated as possible. There will be a certain amount of oxygen deprivation as a result of some of this algae decaying. So to counteract that, you need to make sure you've got as much circulation as possible. Pretty shocking, but it will clear, don't worry. And it's unsightly rather than a problem. Your fish, your wildlife, they're not going to have any problems as a result of this milkiness in the pond. Now what you should find is that over 2 or 3 days the pond starts to clear. After a week or 2 it will resume its full clarity, and I actually tend to find that the pond looks even clearer than it normally is. Now whether that's just because the pond has gone from cloudy to clear over a short period of time and so it looks clearer than it really is, or whether that's as a result of the minerals that are within this that help to really polish the water, I don't know. But a lot of people have commented that water clarity is boosted as a result of using Blank Enhancer. So it is a very good product. The blanket weed that's remaining in the pond after a couple of weeks will start to bleach and turn white, and it just starts to disintegrate, it just disappears, eventually becoming detritus and sediment in the pond. So you may find that once you've treated for blanket weed, it's worth then performing a vacuum on a pond using a sludge vacuum or using a net to try to dredge and remove some of the sediment that forms as a result. Making sure your pumps are free of debris, because they're going to start to collect with some of this decaying algae and potentially clog much more rapidly, is also really important. And making sure that your filtration system is clean and operating efficiently is obviously key. Right, well that's it for today. It's a blooming hot day and I'm looking forward to getting out of these waders. Even in this pond, it doesn't really cool me down very much, and I'm looking forward to spending the rest of the afternoon sitting down in a cold bath. In fact, it was so hot, both my GoPro and my iPhone overheated, and spent the last half an hour in a cool box. So, thank you very much for watching. I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. I'll see you in the next pond.